Madam President, as my colleague said, we're going back and forth on offering amendments to this bill, and I hope that this process will lead us towards getting this bill wrapped up. And I know that many of my colleagues have been talking about various aspects of this legislation, and this particular amendment focuses on making sure that if this project goes forward, that we meet certain environmental standards. I say that how important that is because the first serious delay in the approval process came because a bad route was selected, and this aquifer that was proposed going through the pipeline was critically important to a large percentage of the growing agriculture around that area. So it's very important to me. That was a very glaring example that we need to get this right. Now, what was wrong with that is that Congress was set to intervene then, even intervene and basically say the State Department was wrong and just go ahead and approve this pipeline. And so I feel like we're about at that same point again, where people are saying, just forget the administrative process, let's go ahead and deem this approved. So if Congress, rather than the administration, approves this pipeline, the American people will lose all the protections and conditions attached as part of the national interest determination. And just so people understand, so according to Executive Order 1337, the State Department can require permits to contain, quote, such terms and conditions as the national interest may require. So if the president can decide that a pipeline is in the national interest, he can do so if it is constructed to meet those specific standards. In the case of the State Department's environmental impact, outlined hundreds of conditions that should be met to ensure that the pipeline is built at the safest, highest standard. To quote the environmental impact statement, quote, if the proposed project is determined to serve the national interest, the applicant would be required to abide by certain conditions listed in the EIS and the presidential permit. So these conditions or mitigation measures, as the report refers to them, are compiled in one section of the report, and it highlights the measures that TransCanada needs to deal with and reduce the impacts when they are operating this pipeline. These are higher standards for environmental and public safety the company would be obligated to meet. So the problem is the bill before us would authorize the pipeline without those mechanisms and without those conditions. If TransCanada declined to meet these conditions, there would be no legal recourse for the injured parties to take TransCanada to court. So I'd like to talk about those conditions that are included in the environmental impact statement so that my colleagues understand what we're talking about when they say they would vote to bypass this process. I'll give 3 examples of the conditions that are included in the environmental impact statement. First, along the proposed pipeline, there are areas where the soil is fragile. So that has been a lot of the discussion of the Sandhill region of Nebraska and how difficult it would be to site a pipeline on those very fragile sandy soils. The sand hills are so fragile that the current route goes around them just to compensate. So, however, in southern South Dakota and northern Nebraska, there are areas that, according to the environmental impact statement, quote, exhibit conditions similar to the Sandhill regions and are very susceptible to the challenges that they would face from susceptible wind erosion. So I will read from the appendix about how TransCanada would be required to operate the pipeline in those areas. Quote, this document proves site-specific reclamation plans that itemize construction, erosion control, and revegetation procedures for those fragile areas. To reduce the potential impacts related to severe wind and water and erosion, the following summary of best management practices would be implemented during construction, reclamation, and post-construction, unquote. This document then goes on to list 16 specific bullet points outlined that TransCanada must meet. These conditions for Sandhill area along the route include avoiding wetlands, avoiding erosion, erosion-prone areas like on hilltop ridges, working with the landowners to build fences to prevent livestock from issues with livestock, and providing compensation to landowners who need to let their pastures rest until vegetation can be reestablished. So most people would agree that TransCanada should do these things. I think the American people should say, follow the rules and do the things that are required. It makes sense to do these things from the protection of our environment and vulnerable areas, and for the landowners whose livelihood depend on the land around the pipeline. But before S1 became law, the State Department would, but if S1 became law, the State Department would not have the authority to ensure the things that I just mentioned, that they build the fences, that compensate the ranchers as that were outlined, and the conditions required that the State Department has laid out. So the State Department, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and TransCanada came to this agreement to ensure the protection of the endangered species along the pipeline route. And these important things are part of what we want to see addressed. Implementing an agreement that are designed to avoid harm to these species is what we are trying to make sure the President has the authority to continue to push. In contrast, the bill we're considering, S1, exempts the pipeline from meeting the Endangered Species Act. And according to the State Department, the process that is now underway to establish and implementing these agreements to protect these vulnerable species would stop if this bill became law. So finally, the conditions would require TransCanada to improve safety standards, and my colleagues may not know that TransCanada received a, quote, warning letter from the Federal Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Administration for violating pipeline safety regulations over a year and a half ago, and as outlined in the September 26, 2013 letter from the administration, quote, TransCanada failed to perform welding on construction. TransCanada experienced a high weld rejection rate. TransCanada failed to properly qualify its welders, end quote. So in 1 week alone, 72% of TransCanada's wells had to be replaced, and TransCanada's shoddy work came to light. The State Department said 2 new safety conditions to the 57 conditions that the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Administration had already required. And one of those conditions required TransCanada to hire a third-party contractor to monitor the pipeline construction and report back to the U.S. government whether that construction is sound. So this new condition was that TransCanada adopt a quality management program to ensure that this pipeline is from the beginning built to the highest standards by both the Keystone personnel and many contractors, end quote. But if this legislation is approved, this pipeline and all the conditions I just mentioned fall away. That is why I do not believe that this legislation is we are prematurely acting. So I am offering this amendment. Last week we had very big reminders that pipeline spills do happen. 40,000 gallons of oil spilled from the Yellowstone River in Montana, not the first spill for that river, unfortunately. And so I asked my colleagues, why would we continue on a process without making sure that TransCanada follows the established safety issues on pipelines, and we can make sure that they comply with these environmental laws? So I hope my colleagues will join me in voting for this legislation. I hope my colleagues will stand with 61% of the American people who believe that a due process is more important than special interests.